Imagine a peace rally, tens of thousands gathered,
Yeah.
hopeful for a brighter future, and then
Mhm.
shots ring out.
Yeah.
A nation's hope silenced. This wasn't just any assassination. This was the murder of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
Right.
A pivotal moment that exposed just these deep fault lines running through Israeli society.
Yeah.
And it really set the stage for the rise of the Israeli.
Right. What's so striking is that this didn't happen in a vacuum, you know? Rabin's assassination, it was a culmination of rising tensions, years of disillusionment with the peace process, and then the growing influence of a more hardline nationalist ideology.
Right. And those chants from right-wing protesters, "In blood and fire, we will expel Rabin." I mean, it sent chills down everyone's spine.
Oh, yeah.
You could feel the hatred, the division.
It was a stark warning of just how deeply entrenched these opposing visions for Israel's future had become.
And today we're going to try to untangle this really complex history,
Mm.
exploring the forces that led to this tragic turning point.
Our journey. It starts long before that fateful night in 1995. We need to delve into the roots of the Israeli right, to an ideology known as revisionist Zionism.
Revisionist Zionism. I've heard the term, but to be honest, I'm a bit fuzzy on the details.
Okay.
Refresh my memory.
Well, it's crucial to understand because it lays the groundwork for so much of what we see in Israeli politics today, revisionist Zionism. In contrast to the more mainstream Zionist movement, it advocated for a Jewish state that encompassed not just present-day Israel, but also the territories on the east bank of the Jordan River, the West Bank, and Gaza.
So this ideology planted the seeds for the belief that these territories are inherently part of Israel, which of course has fueled the settlement movement and, complicated peace negotiations for decades.
Precisely. And within this movement, there was a spectrum ranging from those who believed in achieving this greater Israel through political means to those who embraced more extreme and even violent tactics.
Yeah, that brings us to one of the most controversial figures in this story, Rabbi Meir Kahan.
Kahan is a fascinating and to many disturbing figure. He was a firebrand who founded the Jewish Defense League, or JDL, in the United States. Interestingly, he drew inspiration from the Black Power movement, adopting their confrontational tactics and the slogan, "Never Again," as a call to Jewish militancy.
It seems almost paradoxical, drawing inspiration from a movement fighting for racial equality while advocating for Jewish supremacy.
Kahan was full of contradictions. He tapped into the trauma of the Holocaust, invoking the horrors of the past to justify his belief that Jews need to be prepared to defend themselves by any means necessary. He saw enemies everywhere and preached a message of fear and aggression.
And within the context of the already right-leaning revisionist Zionism, Kahan's views were considered extreme right.
Absolutely. His embrace of violence and his blatant calls for the expulsion of Arabs from Israel and the occupied territories were condemned by many, even within the right wing.
So when Kahan moved to Israel in 1971 and founded his Kanak party, did it send shockwaves through the political establishment?
It certainly raised eyebrows. Koch openly campaigned for a theocratic state governed by Jewish religious law, advocating for policies that were seen as discriminatory and even racist by many Israelis. They called for the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza and the expulsion of all Arabs living within those territories.
These ideas sound incredibly radical, even dangerous. Did they find an audience?
While his message was initially seen as fringe, Kahan found a receptive audience among certain segments of Israeli society, particularly some disillusioned Mizrahi Jews.
Mizrahi Jews, for those of us who don't know, could you explain who they are?
Of course, Mizrahi Jews are Jewish Israelis with roots in Middle Eastern and North African countries like Morocco, Iraq, and Yemen. Many felt marginalized by the predominantly European-descended Ashkenazi establishment and believed that their concerns were being ignored by the existing political parties. Kahan's message of Jewish strength and his fiery rhetoric resonated with some who felt a sense of resentment and disenfranchisement.
So even though Kahan and his Kas party remained outside the mainstream, they tapped into a vein of discontent that was brewing beneath the surface of Israeli society. It makes you wonder what kind of impact this would have on the future of the country.
You're absolutely right. And to understand the full impact, we need to shift our focus to a pivotal year. 1977, this is when Menachem Begin and his right-wing Likud party came to power, ending decades of rule by the left-leaning Labor Party.
1977, that was a seismic shift in Israeli politics. What led to this dramatic change?
Well, several factors were at play. Begin, a former leader of the Irgun, a pre-state Zionist paramilitary group, was a charismatic figure who successfully capitalized on the growing disillusionment with the Labor Party and anxieties surrounding the peace process.
Disillusionment. In what way?
Many Israelis were growing increasingly skeptical of the prospects for a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians. They saw territorial concessions as signs of weakness and believed that the Labor Party was willing to give up too much for too little in return. Begin tapped into these anxieties, promising a strong and uncompromising stance on security and territorial integrity.
So Begin's victory signaled a move to the right within Israeli politics. But how did his policies compare to those of the more extreme Kahan?
While both Begin and Kahan were on the right of the political spectrum, they represented very different strands of thought. Begin, though a hardliner, was still committed to operating within the democratic system. He opposed Kahan's extremism and saw him as a dangerous demagogue. Even within the Likud party, Kahan's views were considered far too radical.
Interesting. So even within the right wing, there were clear boundaries. But Begin's victory surely emboldened those who shared his vision of a greater Israel, including the growing settlement movement, right?
You're right. Begin's government provided financial incentives and infrastructure support for settlements, leading to a dramatic increase in their population and making any future land for peace exchange more difficult.
So while Begin represented a more mainstream right wing, Kahan's radical ideas were gaining traction in the same period, finding fertile ground among those who felt that even Likud wasn't tough enough. What a complex and volatile time. It seems like the seeds for the events of 1995 and the rise of figures like Ben-Gvir were sown in this period.
Absolutely. The assassination of Rabin, the rise of Ben-Gvir, these events don't emerge out of thin air. They were rooted in these historical shifts and ideological battles that were taking place within Israeli society.
It's a fascinating and honestly a bit unsettling story unfolding here.
Indeed. And to truly grasp the significance of Rabin's assassination and its aftermath, we need to delve deeper into the legacy of Kahan and the rise of a new generation of right-wing leaders like Ben-Gvir who drew inspiration from his ideology. Well, even though Kahan was gone, his ideas didn't die with him. In fact, they found new life among a younger generation of activists who saw him as a martyr, a visionary who had been silenced for speaking the truth.
And one figure who embodies this legacy is Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's been in the news a lot lately. What's his connection to Kahan?
Ben-Gvir was a devoted follower of Kahan. He rose to prominence during the protests against the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s. His actions, like proudly displaying a car ornament stolen from Rabin's car, were deliberately provocative and designed to inflame tensions.
Yeah, I remember seeing those images on the news, holding up that ornament and declaring, if we can get to Rabin's car, we can get a Rabin. It sent shockwaves through the country. It was a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come.
His rhetoric was often hateful and incendiary. He used inflammatory language to demonize Arabs and incite violence against those he perceived as enemies of the Jewish people.
So how did someone with such a radical past go from a fringe activist to a government minister? It's a pretty stunning trajectory.
It's a complex story, but I think it's important to understand that Ben-Gvir is a master of political strategy. He recognized that to achieve his goals, he needed to move from the margins to the mainstream. He toned down some of his most extreme rhetoric, presenting himself as a defender of Jewish rights and Israeli security rather than an outright Kahanist.
So a bit of rebranding to make his ideology more palatable to a wider audience, it seems to have worked. He's now the leader of the Otzma Yehudit party, which is considered the successor to Kahan's movement. And incredibly, he's now part of Netanyahu's governing coalition.
This alliance between Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir is highly significant. It speaks volumes about the state of Israeli politics and the rightward shift that has been taking place over the past few decades.
Let's talk about Netanyahu. His political career has been marked by both pragmatism and ideology. How has he navigated the various factions within the right wing, and how has his approach contributed to the current situation?
Netanyahu is a shrewd politician. He understands how to play the game of coalition politics. To stay in power, he's had to make deals with various parties across the political spectrum, and as the right wing gained momentum, he's increasingly aligned himself with figures like Ben-Gvir to secure their support and maintain his grip on power.
Some might argue that aligning with the far right was a necessary political maneuver, but hasn't it come at a cost?
That's the key question. By embracing figures like Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu has legitimized their views and given them a platform to spread their message to a wider audience. This has normalized extremism and shifted the political discourse further to the right.
It's like he's opened Pandora's box, and now those extreme ideas are out in the open, shaping policy and influencing public opinion. It seems like a dangerous gamble. What are the potential long-term consequences of this strategy?
Well, it's already having a profound impact on Israeli society. It's contributed to a deepening of the political divide, making it even more difficult to find common ground or to envision a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live together peacefully.
And the recent protests against Netanyahu's judicial reforms suggest that many Israelis are deeply concerned about the direction the country is heading in. They see these reforms, which seek to limit the power of the Supreme Court, as a threat to democracy.
These protests are a sign that Israeli society is at a crossroads. The question now is, will these protests be enough to course correct, or will the rightward trend continue to gain momentum?
It's a crucial moment, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The outcome of this struggle will have profound implications not just for Israel, but for the entire region. It raises a lot of questions. Can a society heal from such deep divisions?
Hmm.
How do you counter extremism when it's become so deeply entrenched in the political system? It's a daunting challenge.
It's certainly not an easy task, but I think it's important to remember that the future is not preordained. Change is possible, but it requires active engagement from those who believe in a more just and equitable society.
So where do we go from here? What are the potential paths forward?
I think it's crucial to start by recognizing the root causes of this rightward shift. It's not just about political maneuvering or individual figures like Gahan or Ben-Gvir. It's also about deeper societal trends, like the growing disillusionment with the peace process, the rise of religious nationalism, and the increasing influence of the settler movement. We need to understand these forces if we want to address them effectively.
It's a complex web of factors, it sounds like. Unpacking this history is essential to figuring out how to move forward, but it can't just be about understanding the past, right? What are the concrete steps that can be taken to counter extremism and promote a more inclusive vision for Israel's future?
That's right. We need to move beyond analysis and into action. And that involves a multi-pronged approach. One key element is education. We need to equip young people with the critical thinking skills to identify and challenge extremist ideologies.
Education is key,
Yeah.
absolutely. But how do you reach those who are already entrenched in these extremist ideologies? Is dialogue even possible?
It's a tough question, but I think it's crucial to create spaces where open and honest conversations can take place, even if it's uncomfortable. We need to find ways to humanize the other and break down the stereotypes and prejudices that fuel hatred and division.
That's a tall order, especially in a context where violence and fear have been so pervasive. How do you build trust and empathy when there's so much historical baggage and ongoing conflict?
It's not easy, that's for sure. It requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to listen to perspectives that we might not agree with. We need to acknowledge the pain and suffering on both sides and find ways to address the legitimate grievances that fuel the conflict.
And that brings us back to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. His vision of peace was tragically cut short. It's a reminder of the fragility of hope and the devastating consequences of extremism.
Rabin's death was a profound loss. He represented a path, not taking a different future that might have been possible. It's hard not to wonder what might have happened had he lived.
It's a somber thought, and it raises some difficult questions about the future. What are the prospects for peace in a region where extremism seems to be on the rise?
It's a challenging landscape, there's no doubt about it. The two-state solution, which was once seen as the most viable path to peace, seems increasingly distant. The expansion of settlements in the West Bank has made it incredibly difficult to envision a contiguous and viable Palestinian state, and the political will to make the necessary compromises seems to be lacking on both sides.
So what are the alternatives? What other possibilities are there?
Some advocate for a one-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians would live together as citizens with equal rights. But this, too, presents immense challenges. Can two peoples with such a history of conflict and mistrust truly coexist as equals? And what would happen to the Jewish character of Israel if it became a binational state? These are questions that Israelis and Palestinians must grapple with together.
It seems like there are no easy answers. This conflict has been going on for so long and it's so deeply entrenched that it's hard to imagine a path forward that doesn't involve more pain and suffering. What role can the international community play in promoting a peaceful resolution?
The international community has a crucial role to play. It can provide support for peace initiatives, mediate between the parties, and hold them accountable for upholding human rights and international law. But ultimately, the solution must come from within. It requires leadership on both sides that is committed to peace and willing to make the tough choices necessary to achieve it.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this complex and often heartbreaking topic, I'm left with a sense of both urgency and uncertainty. The rise of the Israeli right has had profound implications for the region, and the future remains uncertain. But understanding the forces at play, the historical context, and the ideological battles that have shaped this conflict is crucial if we want to have any hope of finding a path toward peace.
I agree, and I think it's important to remember that even amidst the darkness, there are glimmers of hope. There are individuals and organizations on both sides who are working tirelessly to build bridges, to promote understanding, and to create a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace and security. Their efforts may seem small in the face of such a daunting challenge, but they represent the best of humanity, and they remind us that change is always possible.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the forces that continue to shape this volatile region. And we encourage you to stay engaged, to stay informed, and to use your voice to advocate for peace and justice.